Chapter 6. Dhyana Yoga. Dhyana Yoga is incompatible with works. At the close of the next preceding discourse, Dhyana Yoga, yoga by meditation, which is the proximate means to right knowledge, has been taught in a few aphoristic verses. 27th May 2029. Here commences the sixth discourse, which occupies the position of a commentary thereon. Now, action, karma, is an external aid to Dhyana Yoga, and a grihastha, householder, on whom action is enjoined, should perform it till he is able to attain to Dhyana Yoga, and bearing this in mind, the Lord extols action in 6.1. Objection. Now, since action which is enjoined should be performed throughout life, what is the meaning of the limitation, till he is able to attain to Dhyana Yoga? Answer. This objection does not apply here because of the specification that, for the sage who wishes to attain to yoga, action is the means, 6.3, and because it is also said that he who has attained yoga has only to resort to renunciation, sama. If it were meant that each of them, he who wishes to attain to yoga as well as he who has attained to yoga, should resort to both action and renunciation, then it would be useless to specify that action and renunciation are respectively intended for him who wishes to attain yoga and for him who has attained yoga, or to divide them into two distinct classes. The Samuccayavadi maintains that knowledge should be conjoined with action if it should produce the intended result. The opponent, among religious devotees, asramins is equal to grihasthas. One class comprises persons who wish to attain yoga, another class comprises persons who have already attained yoga, while the rest are those who neither wish to attain yoga nor have attained yoga, and it is but right that the first two classes should be specified and shown separately as distinguished from the third. Answer. No, the words, for the same devotee, in 6.3, and the repetition of yoga in the clause, when he has attained to yoga, imply this, that the same person who at first wished to attain to yoga has only to renounce action when he has attained yoga, this renunciation leading to the fruition of yoga. Thus, no action forms a necessary duty throughout life. Failures in yoga are also spoken of here. 6.37,38. If in the sixth discourse yoga were meant for a grihastha, then there could be no occasion for the supposition of his ruin, inasmuch as he, a failure in yoga, may obtain the fruit of karma. An action done, whether interested, kamya, or obligatory and disinterested, nitya, must produce its effect. It cannot of course produce moksha, which, being eternal, cannot be produced by an action. We have also said that the obligatory duty, nitya karma, as taught by so great an authority as the Veda, must produce a result of its own, since, otherwise, the Veda would serve no purpose. Neither would it be proper to speak of a grihastha as a failure in both ways, for he would still perform karma and there would therefore be no occasion for a failure therein. The opponent drives at this conclusion, that while the first and third classes of aspirants are bound to perform karma, those who have attained yoga should not, as belonging to the order of grihasthas, renounce karma, though they may practice yoga with a view to realize the true nature of the self. Wide commentary on 4.18. The opponent, the karma which has been done has been offered to the Lord, wherefore, such karma can bring in no result to the author. Answer. No, for the offering of karma to the Lord must lead to still greater results. The opponent, it leads only to moksha. The offering of all actions to the Lord, when conjoined with yoga, leads to moksha and to no other result, but, since he has failed in yoga, it is but right to suppose that such a man will be ruined. Answer: no, for the verses 6.10-14 enjoin renunciation of action. It is not possible to think of any kind of wife's aid at the time of dhyana. If it were possible, then it might be argued that loneliness is enjoined, 6.10, with a view to prohibit that aid. And what is taught in 6.10, without desire, without property, is not compatible with the life of a grihastha. The question, 6.38.2, regarding him who may prove a failure in both ways would not arise. The opponent, in 6.1, a man of action, karmin, is said to be both a sannyasin and a yogin, and it is further said that he who does no action or keeps no fire cannot be a yogin or a sannyasin. Answer: no. 6.1 merely extols the abandonment of attachment for results of actions, performance of which forms an external aid, bahiranga, to dhyana yoga, which leads one to dhyana yoga in due course. It is not he alone who is without fire and without action that is both a sannyasin and a yogin, but also one devoted to action, who abandoning attachment for the results of actions, performs them for the purification of the mind, sattva shuddhi. Thus by way of praise the latter is said to be a sannyasin and a yogin. It is, moreover, not proper to hold that one and the same proposition both praises the abandonment of attachment for results of actions and forbids the fourth order. Further, the Lord cannot contradict the Shruti, Smriti, the Puranas, the Itihasa and the Yogasastras, which clearly teach that a man who is without fire and without action, who is literally a sannyasin, is a sannyasin and a yogin. To forbid the fourth order would contradict what the Lord himself teaches in 4.13, 12.16, 19, 2.71. That is to say, dhyana yoga as taught in the sequel is not meant for a grihastha who is engaged in works, for he cannot fulfill the conditions laid down in 6.10, 14, etc. Therefore, for the sage who wishes to attain yoga and has already entered on the career of a grihastha, action, such as the Agnihotra, performed without a desire for its fruit becomes, by way of purifying the mind, a means to dhyana yoga. On this ground B is said to be a sannyasin and a yogin by way of praise.
षष्ठोऽध्यायः आत्मसंयमयोगः श्रीभगवानुवाच अनाश्रितः कर्मफलं कार्यं कर्म करोति यः स सन्न्यासी च योगी च न निरग्निर्न चाक्रियः.
Translation: He who, without depending on the fruits of action, performs his bounden duty, he is a sannyasin and a yogin, not he who is without fire and without action. He who desires the fruits of actions is dependent thereon, but different from him is the man in question. He is not dependent on the fruits of actions. He who is thus free from a desire for the fruits of actions and performs action, such as the Agnihotra or fire sacrifice as a bounden duty, nitya karma, not as a kamya karma or action done with a motive, as a means of attaining some immediate specific end in view, he who performs actions thus is superior to those who perform actions in a different spirit. With a view to impress this truth, the Lord says that he is sannyasin and a yogin. he should be regarded as possessing both the attributes of renunciation, sannyas, and steadfastness of mind, yoga. Not he alone should be regarded as a sannyasin and a yogin who is without fire and without action, who neither lights sacrificial fires nor engages in other actions, such as austerities and the like which require no help of sacrificial fires. Objection: in the Shruti, in the Smriti, and in the Yoga Sastras, it is plainly taught that a sannyasin or a yogin is one who is without fire and without action. How is it that the Lord teaches here a strange doctrine that he who lights fire and performs actions is a sannyasin and a yogin? Answer: this is not to be regarded as a fault, for it is intended to represent a devotee to action as a sannyasin and a yogin in a secondary sense of the two terms. He is regarded as a sannyasin because of his renunciation of the thoughts concerning the fruits of action, and he is regarded as a yogin because he performs action as a means of attaining to yoga, or because he abandons thoughts concerning the fruits of actions as causing unsteadiness of mind. Thus, it is only in a secondary sense that the two terms are applied to him. It is not, on the other hand, meant that he is in reality a sannyasin and a yogin. The Lord, accordingly, says,
Yam sannyāsamiti prāhuryogam tam vidhi pandava nahya sannyasta sankalpo yogi bhavati kaschana.
Translation: do you, O Pandav, know yoga to be that which they call renunciation? No one, verily, becomes a yogin who has not renounced thoughts. Do you understand that the yoga, which consists in performance of action, is that which those who are versed in the Shruti and the Smriti declare to be sannyasa, the true renunciation which consists in the abandonment of all action as well as its fruit? Question: on what point of similarity between karma yoga, which consists in the performance of action, pravritti, and the pure sannyas which consists in abstaining from action, nivritti, is the representation of identity of the former with the latter based? Answer: there is of course a certain amount of similarity between karma yoga and pure sannyas so far as the agent is concerned. For he who is a pure sannyasin, who has renounced all actions as well as their accessories, abandons thoughts, samkalp, concerning all actions and their fruits, those thoughts causing the desires which impel one to action. A follower of karma yoga, too, renounces thoughts of results while he performs actions. This the Lord teaches in the following words: no devotee to action who has not given up the thought of reward can be a yogin, a man of steadfastness, for the thought of reward causes unsteadiness of mind. That is to say, that devotee to action who has given up all thoughts of reward will become a yogin, a man of steadfastness, a steady-minded man, inasmuch as all thought of reward which is the cause of unsteadiness has been given up. Action is a stepping stone to dhyana yoga. Thus, having regard to the likeness between pure sannyas and karma yoga in so far as the devotee in either case renounces the thoughts concerning the fruit of action, karma yoga has been represented in 6.2 as sannyas with a view to extol it. And the Lord extols it because the karma yoga, practiced without regard to the fruit of action, forms an external aid, bahiranga, to dhyana yoga, leads the devotee to dhyana yoga, in due course. He now proceeds to show how karma yoga is a means to dhyana yoga.
Arurukshormunir karma karanamuchyate yogarudhasya tasyaiva shamah karanamuchyate.
Translation: for a devotee who wishes to attain to yoga, action is said to be the means. For the same devotee, when he has attained to yoga, quiescence, sama, is said to be the means. For a devotee, muni, who has given up the fruit of action, and who wishes to attain to yoga, who has not already risen to it, who is unable to remain steady in dhyana yoga, action, karma, is said to be the means of attaining his end. For the same devotee, on the other hand, when he has attained to yoga, quiescence, i.e., the abstaining from all action, is said to be the means of attaining his end. The more thoroughly he abstains from action, the more free he is from trouble, the more the senses are controlled, and the more steadfast his mind remains. Then he becomes a yogruddha, one who has attained to yoga. Accordingly, it is said in the Mahabharata, "For a Brahmana there is no wealth equal to this, knowledge of oneness and homogeneity, of Brahman in all creatures, truthfulness, character, steadiness, harmlessness, straightforwardness, and renunciation of the several actions." Santi Parva, 175-38. Who is a yogin? When is a man said to be a yogruddha, to have attained to yoga? The answer follows. His end is dhyana yoga, and this he attains by action which first purifies the mind and then creates desire and capacity for dhyana yoga.
यदा हिनेन्द्रियार्थेषु न कर्मस्वनुषज्यते सर्वसङ्कल्पसन्न्यासी योगारूढस्तदोच्यते.
Translation. When a man, renouncing all thoughts, is not attached to sense objects and actions, then he is said to have attained to yoga. When a yogin, keeping the mind steadfast, feels no attachment for the objects of the senses such as sound, nor thinks that he has to do any action, whether nitya, obligatory, or namittika, obligatory and incidental, or kamya, done with a motive, or pratishidha, forbidden by law, regarding it as of no use to him, and when he has learned to habitually renounce all thoughts which give rise to desires for objects of this world and of the next, then he is said to have become a yogruddha, to be one who has attained to yoga. The words renouncing all thoughts imply that all desires as well as all actions should be renounced. For all desires spring from thoughts, as the Smriti says. Verily desire springs from thought, samkalp, and of thought yagnas are born. Manu 2.2. O desire, I know where your root lies. You art born of thought. I shall not think of you, and you shall cease to exist as well as your root. Mahabharata, Santi Parva, 177-25. On the abandonment of all desires, the abandonment of all actions necessarily follows, as passages in the Shruti like the following show. Whatever forms the object of desire, that he wills, and whatever he wills, that he acts. Reasoning also leads to the same conclusion. For, on surrendering all thoughts, one cannot move at all. Wherefore, by saying that the aspirant should renounce all thoughts, the Lord implies that he should abandon all desires and all actions as well. When a man has attained to yoga, then the self is raised by the self from out of the numerous evils of samsara. Therefore,
उद्धरेदात्मनात्मानं नात्मानमवसादयेत् आत्मैव ह्यात्मनो बन्धुरात्मैव रिपुरात्मनः.
Translation. Let a man raise himself by himself, let him not lower himself, for He alone is the friend of himself, he alone is the enemy of himself. Let a man lift up himself who is drowned in the ocean of samsara, let him so train himself as to become a yogrudha, let him practice and attain to yoga. Let him not lower himself, for he alone is the friend of himself. There is indeed no other friend that can lead to liberation from samsara. Nay, the so-called friend is only inimical to him who seeks liberation, as the former forms an object of affection, which is the cause of bondage. Hence the emphasis he alone is the friend of himself. And he alone is the enemy of himself. The other enemy who is outside is made an enemy only by himself. Hence the emphasis, he alone is the enemy of himself. It has been said that, he alone is the friend of himself, he alone is the enemy of himself. Now it may be asked, what sort of a man is the friend of himself and what sort of a man is the enemy of himself? The answer follows.
बन्धुरात्मात्मनस्तस्य येनात्मैवात्मना जितः अनात्मनस्तु शत्रुत्वे वर्तेतात्मैव शत्रुवत्.
Translation. To him who has conquered himself by himself, his own self is the friend of himself, but to him who has not conquered himself, his own self stands in the place of an enemy like the external foe. His self is the friend of himself who is self-controlled, who has brought under control the aggregate of the body and the senses. But in the case of a man who is not self-controlled, his own self does injury to himself, just as any external foe may do injury to him.
जितात्मनः प्रशान्तस्य परमात्मा समाहितः शीतोष्णसुखदुःखेषु तथा मानापमानयोः.
Translation. The self-controlled and serene man's supreme self is steadfast in cold and heat, in pleasure and pain, as also in honor and disgrace. When a man has subdued the aggregate of the body and the senses, when his mind, antahkarana, is tranquil, when he has renounced all actions, then the Supreme Self actually becomes his own self.
ज्ञानविज्ञानतृप्तात्मा कूटस्थो विजितेन्द्रियः युक्त इत्युच्यते योगी समलोष्टाश्मकाञ्चनः.
Translation. The yogin whose self is satisfied with knowledge and wisdom, who remains unshaken, who has conquered the senses, he is said to be a saint, for whom a lump of earth, a stone and gold are equal. When the yogin is satisfied with knowledge, jnana, of things as taught in the scriptures, and with wisdom, vijnana, with the realization, in his own experience, of the things so taught, then he is said to be a saint. Yukta, he is said to have attained samadhi or steadfastness of mind. Moreover,
सुहृन्मित्रार्युदासीनमध्यस्थद्वेष्य बन्धुषु साधुष्वपि च पापेषु समबुद्धिर्विशिष्यते.
Translation. He is esteemed, who is of the same mind to the good-hearted, friends, foes, the indifferent, the neutral, the hateful, relatives, the righteous, and the unrighteous. He is esteemed, he is the best among the yogrudhas, among those who have attained to yoga. There is also another reading which means he is liberated. Who is of the same mind, who thinks not of a man as to what he is or what he does. A good-hearted man does good to another without expecting any service in return. An indifferent man is one who is partial to neither of two contending sides. A neutral man is one who means well by both the contending sides. The righteous are those who follow the Shastras, and the unrighteous are those who resort to forbidden acts. Directions for the practice of yoga. Wherefore, to attain the highest results,
योगी युञ्जीत सततम् आत्मानं रहसि स्थितः एकाकीयत चित्तात्मा निराशीरपरिग्रहः.
Translation. Let the yogin try constantly to keep the mind steady, remaining in seclusion, alone, with the mind and body controlled, free from desire, and having no possessions. Yogin, he who meditates in seclusion, in a mountain cave, or the like. The words in seclusion and alone evidently show that he should resort to renunciation, sannyasa. Not only should he renounce the world when he practices yoga, but he should also abandon all possessions. Now, in the sequel, the Lord proceeds to prescribe for him who practices yoga particular modes of sitting, eating, recreation and the like as aids to yoga, as also to define the characteristic marks of the man who has attained yoga, and to describe the effects of yoga and other particulars in connection with it. First of all, he prescribes a particular mode of sitting as follows.
शुचौ देशे प्रतिष्ठाप्य स्थिरमासनमात्मनः नात्युच्छ्रितं नातिनीचं चैलाजिनकुशोत्तरम् तत्रैकाग्रं मनः कृत्वा यतचित्तेन्द्रियक्रियः उपविश्यासने युञ्ज्याद्योगमात्मविशुद्धये.
Translation. Having in a cleanly spot established a firm seat, neither too high nor too low, with cloth, skin, and cush grass thereon. Making the mind one-pointed, with the actions of the mind and the senses controlled, let him, seated there on the seat, practice yoga for the purification of the self. Cleanly, either naturally so, or made so by artificial improvements. Cloth should be spread on the seat in the reverse order of their enumeration here. What should be done after establishing the seat? He should withdraw the mind from all sense objects before concentrating it. The self, the antakarana. The inner sense, the mind. The external seat has been described. Now, what should be the posture of the body? Listen.
समं कायशिरोग्रीवं धारयन्नचलं स्थिरः सम्प्रेक्ष्य नासिकाग्रं स्वं दिशश्चानवलोकयन् प्रशान्तात्मा विगतभिर्ब्रह्मचारिव्रते स्थितः मनः संयम्य मच्चित्तो युक्त आसीत मत्परः.
Translation. Holding erect and still the body, the head and the neck, firm, gazing on the tip of his nose, without looking around. Serene-minded, fearless, firm in the vow of godly life, having restrained the mind, thinking on me, and balanced, let him sit, looking up to me as the Supreme. An erect body may be in motion, hence the qualification, still. He is to gaze as it were on the tip of his nose. Here we have to understand the words as it were, for the Lord means to prescribe, not the very act of gazing on the tip of his nose, but the fixing of the eyesight within, by withdrawing it from external objects, and this, of course, depends on the steadiness of mind. If, on the other hand, the very act of gazing on the tip of his nose were meant here, then the mind would be fixed only there, not on the self. As a matter of fact, the yogin is to concentrate his mind on the self, as will be taught in 6.25, making the mind dwell in the self. Wherefore the words, as it were, being understood, gazing means here, the fixing of the eye flight within. Moreover, the vow of godly life, brahmachari vrita, consists in doing service to the Guru, in eating of the food obtained by begging. He should strictly observe the vows of godly life. He should also restrain the mind, repress its modifications. He should ever think of me, the Parmeshwar, the Supreme Lord. He should also regard me as the Supreme. A lover may always think of a woman, but he never regards her as supreme. He regards either his sovereign, or Mahadev, the great God, as the case may be, as the supreme. The yogin, on the other hand, ever thinks of me, and also regards me as the supreme being. Now the fruit of yoga is described as follows.
युञ्जन्नेवं सदात्मानं योगी नियतमानसः शान्तिं निर्वाणपरमां मत्संस्थामधिगच्छति.
Translation. Thus always keeping the mind balanced, the yogin, with the mind controlled, attains to the peace abiding in me, which culminates in nirvana, moksha. Thus, in the manner prescribed above. Here follow regulations as regards a yogin's food.
नात्यश्नतस्तु योगोऽस्ति न चैकान्तमनश्नतः न चाति स्वप्नशीलस्य जाग्रतो नैव चार्जुन.
Translation. Yoga is not possible for him who eats too much, nor for him who does not eat at all, nor for him who is addicted to too much sleep, nor for him who is, ever, wakeful, O Arjuna. Eats too much, eats more food than what is suited to him. The Shruti says, whatever food is suited to oneself, that protects, it injures not. A greater quantity injures and a smaller quantity protects not. Satapatpa Brahmana. The yogin should therefore eat neither more nor less than what is suitable for him. Or it may mean this, yoga is not possible for him who eats more than the quantity prescribed for a yogin in the Yoga Sastra. The quantity of food is thus prescribed. Half, the stomach, for food and condiments, the third, quarter, for water, and the fourth should be reserved for free motion of air. How then can yoga be achieved? The answer follows.
युक्ताहार विहारस्य युक्तचेष्टस्य कर्मसु युक्तस्वप्नावबोधस्य योगो भवति दुःखः.
Translation. To him whose food and recreation are moderate, whose exertion in actions is moderate, whose sleep and waking are moderate, to him accrues yoga which is destructive of pain. To him who resorts to food and recreation, such as walking, within prescribed limits, and who sleeps and who wakes up at the prescribed hours, to him accrues yoga which is destructive of the misery of samsara. Consummation. When does he become a saint, yukta? The answer follows.
यदा विनियतं चित्तमात्मन्येवावतिष्ठते निःस्पृहः सर्वकामेभ्यो युक्त इत्युच्यते तदा.
Translation. When the well-restrained thought is established in the self only, without longing for any of the objects of desire, then he is said to be a saint. Well-restrained, which attain to one-pointedness or concentration. In the self only, having abandoned all thoughts of external objects, the thinking principle, chitta, remains steadily in the self. Objects of desire, seen or unseen, The simple of such a yogin's steadfast mind is described below.
यथा दीपो निवातस्थो नेङ्गते सोपमा स्मृता योगिनो यतचित्तस्य युञ्जतो योगमात्मनः.
Translation. As a lamp in a sheltered spot does not flicker, this has been thought as the simile of a yogin of subdued thought, practicing yoga in the self. This simile has been thought out by those versed in yoga, by those who know the ways of the thinking principle. Having thus, by virtue of the practice of yoga, become one-pointed, fit for concentration, like a lamp sheltered from the wind.
यत्रो परमते चित्तं निरुद्धं योगसेवया यत्र चैवात्मनात्मानं पश्यन्नात्मनि तुष्यति सुखमात्यन्तिकं यत्तद्बुद्धिग्राह्यमतीन्द्रियम् वेत्ति यत्र न चैवायं स्थितश्चलति तत्त्वतः यं लब्ध्वा चापरं लाभं मन्यते नाधिकं ततः यस्मिन् स्थितो न दुःखेन गुरुणापि विचाल्यते.
Translation. When thought is quiescent, restrained by the practice of yoga, when, seeing the self by the self, he is satisfied in his own self. When the mind is restrained from all quarters by practice of yoga, the yogin sees the self, the supreme intelligence, Chaitanya, and the all-resplendent light by self, the Antakarna, the inner sense, by the mind which has been purified by samadhi and attains satisfaction in the self. And when he knows that infinite joy which, transcending the senses, can be grasped by reason, when, steady, in the self, he moves never from the reality. He, the wise man. That joy can be grasped by reason, buddhi, independently of the senses, it lies beyond the ken of the senses, it is not produced by sense objects. And when, having obtained it, he thinks no other acquisition superior to it, when, therein established, he is not moved even by a great pain. It the gain of the self. Therein, in the real self. Pain, such as may be caused by a sword cut, etc. This yoga, this peculiar state of the self which has been described in so many of its attributes in the verses beginning with 6.20.
तं विद्या दुःखसंयोगवियोगं योगसंज्ञितम् स निश्चयेन योक्तव्यो योगो निर्विण्णचेतसा सङ्कल्पप्रभवान् कामान् त्यक्त्वा सर्वान् शेषतः मनसैवेन्द्रियग्रामं विनियम्य समन्ततः.
Translation. This severance from union with pain, be it known, is called union, yoga. That yoga must be practiced with determination and with undepressed heart. Severance front union with pain is called yoga, which means union, by a sort of irony. Having thus concluded speaking of the effect of yoga, the Lord again refers to the necessity of it, with a view to show that determination and non-depression, self-reliance, are necessary means to yoga, that yoga, the yoga which can produce the result described above. Further directions concerning the practice of yoga. Moreover, abandoning without reserve all fancy-born desires, while restraining all the senses from all quarters by the mind, endued with discrimination.
शनैः शनैरुपरमेद् बुद्ध्या धृतिगृहीतया आत्मसंस्थं मनः कृत्वा न किञ्चिदपि चिन्तयेत्.
Translation. Little by little let him withdraw, by reason, buddhi, held in firmness, keeping the mind established in the self, let him not think of anything. He should make the mind constantly abide in the self, bearing in mind that the self is all and that nothing else exists. This is the highest form of yoga. Now, as to the yogin who thus strives to make the mind abide in the self.
यतो यतो निश्चलति मनश्चञ्चलमस्थिरम् ततस्ततो नियम्यैतदात्मन्येव वशं नयेत्.
Translation. By whatever cause the wavering and unsteady mind wanders away, from that let him restrain it and bring it back direct under the control of the self. Sound and other objects are the causes which make the point mind wander away. It is a natural weakness of the mind to be thus led away by sense objects. By convincing oneself of the illusoriness of sense objects through an investigation into their real nature, and by cultivating indifference to worldly objects, the mind can be restrained from sense objects and brought back to the self wherein to abide firmly. In virtue of this practice of yoga, the yogin's mind attains peace in the self. The effect of dhyana yoga.
प्रशान्तमनसं ह्येनं योगिनं सुखमुत्तमम् उपैति शान्तरजसं ब्रह्मभूतमकल्मषम्.
Translation. Supreme bliss verily comes to this yogin, whose mind is quite tranquil, whose passion is quieted, who has become Brahman, who is blemishless. Whose passion, in whom all passion, including attachment and other causes of pain, has disappeared, who has become a Jivan Mukta, a man whose soul is liberated while still alive, convinced that all is Brahman, who has no blemish whatsoever, who is not affected by dharma and adharma.
युञ्जन्नेवं सदात्मानं योगी विगतकल्मषः सुखेन ब्रह्म संस्पर्शमत्यन्तं सुखमश्नुते.
Translation. Thus always keeping the self steadfast, the yogin, freed from sins, attains with ease to the infinite bliss of contact with the Supreme Brahman. Always, unimpeded by any of the obstacles to yoga. Now will be described the effect of yoga, the perception of oneness with Brahman, which leads to the cessation of all samsara.
सर्वभूतस्थमात्मानं सर्वभूतानि चात्मनि ईक्षते योगयुक्तात्मा सर्वत्र समदर्शनः.
Translation. The self abiding in all beings, and all beings, abiding in the self, sees he whose self has been made steadfast by yoga, who everywhere sees the same. He sees all beings from Brahma, the Creator, down to a clump of grass as one with the self, and in all the different beings from Brahma, the Creator, down to inanimate objects he sees the same. He sees that the self and Brahman, the Absolute, are one. Now will be described the effect of this perception of the unity of the self.
यो मां पश्यति सर्वत्र सर्वं च मयि पश्यति तस्याहं न प्रणश्यामि स च मे न प्रणश्यति.
Translation. He who sees me everywhere and sees everything in me, to him I vanish not, nor to me does he vanish. He who sees me, Vasudeva, the self of all, in all beings, and who sees Brahma, the Creator, and all other beings, in me the self of all, when he has thus seen the unity of the self, I who am the Ishvara never leave his presence, nor does that wise man leave my presence, for his self and mine are one, and one's own self cannot but be manifest to oneself. Now, referring to the knowledge imparted in the preceding verse, namely that I myself, the self of all, am the seer of the unity of self, the Lord will speak of moksha as the effect of that knowledge.
सर्वभूतस्थितं यो मां भजत्येकत्वमास्थितः सर्वथा वर्तमानोऽपि स योगी मयि वर्तते.
Translation. Whoso, intent on unity, worships me who abide in all beings, that yogin dwells in me, whatever his mode of life. This man of right knowledge dwells in me, in the supreme state, in the state of Vishnu. He is ever liberated, nothing obstructs his path to moksha. Moreover,
आत्मौपम्येन सर्वत्र समं पश्यति योऽर्जुन सुखं वा यदि वा दुःखं स योगी परमो मतः.
Translation. Whoso, by comparison with himself, sees the same everywhere, O Arjuna, be it pleasure or pain, he is deemed the highest yogin. He sees that whatever is pleasant to himself is pleasant to all creatures, and that whatever is painful to himself is painful to all beings. Thus, seeing that what is pleasure or pain to himself is alike pleasure or pain to all beings, he causes pain to no being, he is harmless. Doing no harm, and devoted to right knowledge, he is regarded as the highest among all yogins. Practice and indifference are the surest means to yoga. Seeing that the yoga above described, the yoga of right knowledge, is very difficult of attainment, Arjuna wished to know the surest means of attaining it, and said,
Arjuna uvacha yoyam yogastvaya proktah samyena madhusudana etasyaham na pashyami chanchalatvat sthitim sthiram.
Translation. Arjuna said, this yoga in equanimity, taught by you, O destroyer of Madhu, I see not its steady continuance, because of the restlessness of the mind. This is a well-known fact.
Chanchalam hi manah Krishna pramathi balavadhrudham tasyaham nigraham manye vayoriva sudushkaram.
Translation. The mind verily is, O Krishna, restless, turbulent, strong and obstinate, thereof the restraint I deem quite as difficult as that of the wind. Krishna is derived from krish, to scrape. Krishna is so called because he scrapes or draws away all sins and other causes of evil from his devotees. Not only is the mind restless, but also turbulent. It agitates the body and the senses and makes them subject to foreign influences. It is not possible to restrain it by any means, as it is quite irrepressible. It is as impossible to cut it as to cut the tantunga, the varunapasa, a kind of shark. To restrain the mind of such a nature is even more difficult than to restrain the wind. The Lord says, so it is as you say.
Shri Bhagavan uvacha asamshayam mahabaho mano durnigraham chalam abhyasena tu kaunteya vairagyena cha gryhyate.
Translation. Doubtless, O mighty armed, the mind is hard to restrain and restless, but by practice, O son of Kunti, and by indifference it may be restrained. Practice consists in constantly repeating the same idea or thought regarding some one object of thought. Indifference means freedom from desire for any pleasures seen or unseen, attained through a constant perception of evil in them. It is by practice and indifference that vikshepa, the passage of thought in the direction of external objects can be restrained. It is thus that the mind is restrained. But as regards him who is not self-controlled,
असंयतात्मना योगो दुष्प्राप इति मे मतिः वश्यात्मना तु यतता शक्यो वाप्तुमुपायतः.
Translation. Yoga, methinks, is hard to attain for a man of uncontrolled self, but by him who, often, strives, self-controlled, it can be acquired by proper means. Uncontrolled self, the antahkarana not controlled by means of constant practice and by indifference to worldly gain. Self-controlled, who has subdued the mind. Failures in yoga and the after career. On engaging in the practice of yoga, all works which are the means of attaining success in this world and in the other world have been renounced, while the right knowledge, which is the result of perfection in yoga and which is the means to moksha, has not yet been attained, and the yogin's mind strays away from the path of yoga at the time of death. Arjuna thought that such a man would meet destruction and therefore asked.
Arjuna uvacha ayati shraddhayopeto yogacchalitamanasah aprapya yoga samsiddhim kamgatim krishna gacchati.
Translation. Arjuna said, he who strives not, but who is possessed of faith, whose mind wanders away from yoga, having failed to attain perfection in yoga, what end, O Krishna, does he meet? He has faith in the efficacy of yoga but does not strive in the path of yoga, and during the last moments of life his mind wanders away from yoga, with memory lost. Having failed to attain the fruition of yoga, namely, right knowledge, what end does such a man meet?
Kachinno bhaya vibrashtaschinnaabhramiva nashyati apratishto mahabaho vimudho brahmanah pathi.
Translation. Having failed in both, does he not perish like a raven cloud, supportless, O mighty armed, and perplexed in the path to Brahman? Both, the path of karma and the path of yoga. The path to Brahman, the path by which Brahman can be reached.
Etanme samshayam Krishna chetumarhasya sheshatah tvadanyas samshayasyasya chetanah hyupapadyate.
Translation. This doubt of mine, O Krishna, do you dispel completely, for none other than yourself can possibly destroy this doubt. None other, be he a rishi or deva. You alone canst destroy this doubt.
Shri Bhagavan uvacha parthanaibeha namutra vinashastasya vidyate nahi kalyana krit kaschid durgatim data gacchati.
Translation. The blessed Lord said, O Parth, neither in this world nor in the next is there destruction for him, none, verily, who does good, my son, ever comes to grief. He who has failed in yoga will not be subject to a lower birth than the present one either here or hereafter. My son, S.K. Tata, is translated into son. Tata, in Sanskrit means father, because the father propagates, sk root tan, himself in the form of his son. Since thus the father himself is the son also is called Tata. Even a disciple, though not a son, is addressed as son because he is like a son. What, then, will happen to him?
प्राप्य पुण्यकृतां लोकानुषित्वा शाश्वतीः समाः शुचीनां श्रीमतां गेहे योगभ्रष्टोऽभिजायते.
Translation. Having attained to the worlds of the righteous and having dwelt there for eternal years, he who failed in yoga is reborn in a house of the pure and wealthy. This is said, as the context shows, of a sannyasin engaged in the path of dhyana, yoga. The righteous, those who worship by the Ashvamedha or horse sacrifice. Having completely enjoyed the pleasure he is entitled to, in such a world, he is reborn in a house of the pure and wealthy. The pure, acting according to the prescribed rules.
अथवा योगिनामेव कुले भवति धीमताम् एतद्धि दुर्लभतरं लोके जन्म यदीदृशम्.
Translation. Else, he is born in family of wise yogins only. This, verily, a birth like this, is very hard to obtain in this world. Or else he is born in quite a different family, that of poor wise yogins. A birth in a family of this sort, in a family of poor yogins, is more difficult to obtain than the one mentioned above. And for the following reason.
तत्र तं बुद्धिसंयोगं लभते पौर्वदेहिकम् यतते च ततो भूयः संसिद्धौ कुरु नन्दन.
Translation. There he gains touch with the knowledge that was acquired in the former body and strives more than before for perfection, O son of the Kurus. More than before, with greater vigor than that with which we strove in the former birth.
पूर्वाभ्यासेन तेनैव ह्रियते ह्यवशोऽपि सः जिज्ञासुरपि योगस्य शब्दब्रह्माति वर्तते.
Translation. By that very former practice is he borne on, though unwilling. Even he who merely wishes to know of yoga rises superior to the word Brahman. The man who failed in yoga is borne on towards perfection by the force of the practice of the former birth. If he had done no unrighteous deed, adharma, which could overpower the tendency caused by the practice of yoga, then, certainly, the tendency of yoga prevails. If adharma be stronger, then, even the tendency born of yoga is certainly overpowered by a-point dharma. But on the exhaustion of adharma the tendency caused by yoga begins to produce its effects, that is to say, it is not doable to destruction though it may have long been in abeyance. Thus he, as the context shows, a sannyasin who has failed in yoga who works in the path of yoga, only wishing to know its nature, even he will free himself from the word Brahman, Sabda Brahman, from the effects of the observance of Vedic karma. What need is there to say that he who knows yoga and practices it in steady devotion will be free from its effects? The best of yogins. And why is the life of a yogin preferable?
प्रयत्नाद्यतमानस्तु योगी संशुद्ध किल्बिषः अनेक जन्म संसिद्धस्ततो याति परां गतिम्.
Translation. Verily, a yogin who strives with assiduity, purified from sins and perfected in the course of many births, then reaches the supreme goal. In the course of many births he acquires facility in yoga little by little, and by the aggregate facility thus acquired in many births he is perfected. Then he obtains right knowledge and reaches the supreme goal.
तपस्विभ्योऽधिको योगी ज्ञानिभ्योऽपि मतोऽधिकः कर्मिभ्यश्चाधिको योगी तस्माद् योगी भवार्जुन.
Translation. A yogin is deemed superior to men of austerity, and superior to even men of knowledge. He is also superior to men of action. Therefore be you a yogin, O Arjuna. Knowledge of the teachings of the Shastra. Action, such as Agnihotra. Worship of the sacred fire.
योगिनामपि सर्वेषां मद्गतेनान्तरात्मना श्रद्धावान् भजते यो मां समे युक्ततमो मतः.
Translation. Of all yogins, whoso, full of faith, worships me with his inner self abiding in me, he is deemed by me as most devout. Yogins, those who meditate upon Rudra, Aditya, etc. The inner self abiding in me, the Antahkarana steadfast in me, Vasudeva. Thank you for watching. Please support us. Please like, share, subscribe.